Nenhum dos antigos irá permanecer, né?
Oi?
Nenhum dos antigos da mesa vão permanecer, né?
Não, pode trocar tudo, por favor.
Pega dois cargos conselheiro, vira o superintendente. Quantos são? 1, 2, 3, 4. Vai por mas depois eu acabei parando a barra. Vamos gosto, vamos gosto. Toda vez. Em um momento de crise.
Agora não. Antes era na base do jet. Ela tinha uma aula de jet, mas agora.
But super great to meet you at this event. I went to Revlon last year.
Vamos recomeçar, é isso?
Ele já meteu o cara no cargo dele na hora que ele pegar esse cara.
Shall we restart?
Eu sou eficiente. Eficiente no sentido do microfone, não do microfone.
Você tem jogado
Mais para aproveitar o embalo. Economizou uma parte.
Você achou que ficou ruim? Acho que não. Fica até mais espaço.
São leituras que eu estou adiando, porque eu acho que, de fato, o precedente histórico, acho que mais pertinente, também mais alvissaria.
It's too low your chair. You'd like to bring it up?
Fazendo
I think it's
um
this
século de
side.
atraso, vivendo um século de atraso, o processo
Down, down, a little bit down.
passaram.
Oh, I see. Oh, well, yeah. Oh, I see. I got it.
Better?
Eu estudei.
Eu tenho Carlos.
Mas a tua...
Okay, so let's restart for the second part of our session. Again, many thanks to Professor Ackerman for being present in this discussion with our anti-corruption group here at our law school. And I would like first to introduce the members of our table, just to give Professor Ackerman an idea who are going to be the people that are making questions to you. Okay? So starting to the left, we have Laura Diniz. She's a journalist specialized in legal matters. She's a co-founder of Jota and publisher of Jota.com, a leading Brazilian judiciary news website. She worked in a large magazine called Veja and also in a large newspaper here in Brazil, Estado de São Paulo, two of the largest Brazilian communication media. She's also a vice president of the Instituto Não Aceito Corruption. In a free translation, should be something like, I do not accept corruption. It's an institute, an anti-corruption NGO in Brazil. So this is Laura. She's on the extreme left. Then we have Gustavo Húngaro. He's Bachelor and Master of Law by University of São Paulo. He's a lawyer and professor. He's the General Ombudsman of the state of São Paulo, member and former president of the National Council of Internal Control, dedicated to promote transparency by the effectiveness of the free access to public information as a strategy to fighting corruption. In my left, we have Nino Oliveira Toldo. He holds a PhD in law from the University of São Paulo. He's a federal judge for 25 years. He's a judge in the Federal Court of Appeals of São Paulo and has been the former president of AJUF, that's the Brazilian Association of Federal Judges. He has judged several criminal cases in the federal justice. Okay. To your right, he was already in the previous session, but due to his very intelligent questions, we invited him to be back here in our table again. It's Paulo Furquim. Yeah. He's a senior fellow professor at INSPER and the director of the Center for Business Studies. He was a visiting professor at MIT and visiting scholar at the University of California at Berkeley. He's author of a number of articles on competition policy, regulation, and law and economics. He was also a commissioner at the Brazilian Competition Authority. And last but not least,
At the far right.
at the far right,
Jair Bolsonaro.
But you're at the far left.
yeah,
It depends on the perspective. Good. Thank you for helping me.
yeah. He's in the far right, but he's not from the right, even from the right. Sérgio Fausto is a political scientist and executive director of the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Institute Foundation. He's also a co-director of Plataforma Democrática initiative and a contributing expert to the Latin American initiative out of Rice University. In 2012, he was awarded the Gus Hart Fellowship, given annually by the Chicago Council of Global Affairs to academics and policymakers for their contribution to democracy and development in Latin America. So these are the members of the table, and just as an warm-up, I prepared a first question to Professor Ackerman. Again, thank you very much for being here in this session. And I think that there is no better moment for you to be in a country like Brazil. You who are an academician and someone who studies corruption. Certainly there is no better time to visit our country. For sure you are aware and you are following the corruption scandal. Brazil is being a victim for more than 10 years now made public by the 2014 car wash operation. We are talking about a scandal that involves astronomical figures measured in billions of dollars, perpetrated by a true criminal organization. The efforts undertaken by the task force from the car wash operation have the aim of investigation the facts, the parties, and the responsibilities of this criminal scheme. The parties involved are large corporations, powerful executives, well-known politicians, political parties, financial operators, and services suppliers. The car wash task force, with an enormous support of the population, is trying to influence lawmakers in adopting more severe laws for the punishment of those eventually convicted. There is, in this very moment, as you know, a special committee in the Brazilian Congress analyzing the 10 anti-corruption measures as proposed by the federal prosecutors. Subscribed, it's important, by a petition with more than 2.2 million citizens' signatures. On the other hand, there seems to have a counter-movement led mainly by some prestigious criminal lawyers who are involved in the defense of the indicted clients. They argue against the methods used by the prosecutors in charging the clients, such as the lack of strong evidence, the provisional or temporary arrests, and in respect to plea bargains offered to their clients. In the United States, there is a well-known act from 1970 called the RICO Act. For the audience, RICO means Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organization Act. Some criminal lawyers in the United States have been accusing RICO Act as subverting, I quote, subverting liberty and the true purpose of law. So my question is the following, Professor Ackerman. And this follows a little bit what Paulo Furquim has mentioned in the previous event. Which lessons Brazil can learn from the American experience in dealing with these contradictory visions between prosecutors and criminal lawyers, basically after the RICO Act from 1970? And as a consequence, passing adequate laws is sufficient for dealing with systemic corruption?
You want me to answer, or you want to hear it from
This is complex enough question.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
of course
maybe.
I have-
Yeah.
I have the
If you-
right answer right here.
Okay, if you don't mind.
Okay, so I agree that RICO is a contested statute that has been expanded to cover all kinds of collaborative activities, not just mafias, and there certainly are some line drawing cases that one could critique, but it also does provide, I think, a useful tool in many of these cases. Plea bargains, are a very important feature of American criminal law generally, and in ordinary crimes, not just in the sort of white-collar crimes, and of course are partly a reflection of the time and trouble it takes to actually go through, not to agree to a plea bargain, but to go through with a general case, so that the critique of it, I think, feeds back into a critique of the way the system works, that it needs to work more quickly and more effectively. I do have problems with preventive detention as a way of trying to go forward with cases, but I understand the reason why the prosecutors are defending it. It's partly a way of dealing with other problems in the system, which have to do with the long delays that the defendants can exercise or can take advantage of, and it's trying to kind of give them some incentive to speed things up, right? And the claim is by the prosecutors that this is necessary to prevent people from fleeing, from running away, right? And that does seem to me a justification. I mean, a reason why, if you accuse somebody of something, you don't want them to just leave and not be able to prosecute them. But I can't speak to the details of the criminal law in Brazil, of course. But it does seem to me to be something that needs to be minimized, right? That it's not something to be very proud of, that this is what you're doing, because it does have that problem of punishing people before you've actually had a judgment by a court that they are guilty. So the evidence that they're going to, first is the evidence they're going to flee has to be pretty strong, and second, are there alternatives, right? Are there other ways of kind of freezing their assets? Can you take actions that would have some of the same effect that don't involve actually preventive detection? I should just basically say I'm not an expert on American criminal white-collar crime law, but it does, so it may have more lessons for you than I can actually tell you, but it probably does have some lessons. Well, the important thing to notice is that you're probably aware of the Supreme Court case to do with the governor of Virginia, McDonnell. This was not business. There was a businessman who did all kinds of things that really sound pretty unattractive with respect to the favors he was trying to get from the governor, and the governor tried to get him to get some benefits for this guy, but it turned out he didn't succeed. Right? His own bureaucrats, his own public officials, the other people he was dealing with, never really treated this seriously, and so the guy's previous convictions were thrown out by the Supreme Court. But if you should read that case before you get very upset, oh dear, we can't get after municipal or state corruption, you should read that case. It's worth reading because it's quite narrowly focused. It's really basically narrowly focused on a failure of Virginia law to make what this guy did against the law for elected politicians, and they have subsequently changed their law to make taking these kind of personal benefits. I mean, they did, and Roberts even says at the end of the opinion, well, of course, it's all kind of sleazy stuff that he did. He took I took a Rolex watch and money to fix up his house, and it just really kind of garden variety unpleasant stuff that the politician did that you think he shouldn't be allowed to do. And the basic point of the Supreme Court decision was, well, the Virginia law was not covering this thing, and you couldn't. And he was pointing very much. The court was pointing to the lack of a quid pro quo that actually happened. Now, I think you could argue, I would argue, that a good anti-corruption statute should not depend on a showing by the prosecutor of a quid pro quo in order to convict somebody, right? You should be able to just show that he took the stuff, right? And in a way that created a risk that he was doing something in return, that there shouldn't be this huge burden on the prosecutor. But in fact, under Virginia law, that was what had been done. So it has raised some questions about some existing anti-corruption things against public officials, not against the businesses that paid, that suggests that maybe we need to do some thinking at the state level. We have this problem you maybe have in Brazil as well of a strong federal system with respect to many of the things that we're talking about here. The other thing maybe just to mention is these things called deferred prosecution agreements, which I guess you're beginning to do here in Brazil, that are deals, basically, that the government makes with a corporation to reform its internal operation, to deal with or to increase the risk of corruption going forward. And I think you need to be cautious about this, but it does seem to me like an additional tool for prosecutors to use. My only problem with the sort of best practice discussion about corporate social responsibility here, in this and some other areas, is that on the corporate side, the corporations want to have a very clear list of here's the stuff we should do, to be able to tell you, the lawyers, that we've had best practice. And they really are pushing to get this list of what's best practice. But there's almost zero empirical evidence that this actually is best practice. I mean, it's not a good idea to just kind of accept a certain list of things that have come out of, say, the Chamber of Commerce or the a business association, that these are the things you ought to be doing. So we need to be suspicious about it, even if it is, of course, something that gives the government some leverage in terms of getting change. So maybe that's enough to let other people talk.
Okay. There is no any special order for the questions, so please feel free, all the members of this round table, to asking questions to Professor Ackerman.
Ladies first.
Okay. It's up to you, Laura.
Professor, sharing Professor Paulo's concerns about the viability of political reform here in Brazil on federal level, could you share with us some cases, some examples of reforms in political systems in another developing countries like Brazil, please?
Well, I agree with you that it's we don't have a lot of simple examples. We have a lot of efforts. Mexico is trying. They have a new law which is then heavily criticized by some of the people who were not supportive of this law, but they're making some efforts. Rwanda is often pointed to as a country that has, in the post-conflict period, has successfully reduced corruption. I think Rwanda is a little bit, Rwanda, like Hong Kong and Singapore, which are also pointed to, are rather suspicious examples because they are questionable examples because they're pretty authoritarian places, right? And there's an ease with which authoritarians can try to tackle corruption, but also can use it as a tool against opponents, which I think has happened in Rwanda. And there's a nice essay by somebody connected with a big European Union project showing how the sort of outright corruption is not so high in Rwanda, but there's quite a lot of very cozy relationships between a business elite and the government. So I don't think I've got great examples. You certainly have had. Some of the Eastern European cases are worth looking at. I mean, because all of those countries had to make anti-corruption reforms in the transition period to becoming members of the European Union. And so they did quite a lot at the legal level, not, of course, in all kinds of areas, in all kinds of regulatory areas. And it's worth looking at how much that actually has mattered, right? Because, as you know, in Brazil, having the laws on the books is a very different thing from whether it actually makes any difference. They're also having, of course, to comply with, at least for some things, with European Union requirements on procurement. And there is some work of people studying the procurement activities in some of those countries. So I don't have like an easy, clear-cut example of okay, here's what you do and it'll work. People have pointed to Chile. There's a paper by I could get the reference for you, but Chile is apparently a country that was very corrupt. This is a while in the past, and had a transformation that was, not too different to what happened in the U.S. that I was talking about, that has made it not uncorrupt, or no place has zero corruption. As I was telling you with this U.S. case, we've got corruption in the U.S. too, but has reduced corruption there. So, and Korea is another example, right? So, where at the time of Korea moving to becoming a more democratic country, it moved from a public acceptance or not acceptance of, but just of having to live with, let's put it that way, with corruption, to more aggressive concern with reducing corruption, and it went along with the democratization, a greater democratization in the country. And maybe Taiwan is also a bit of an example, where they had, which is a difficult example because they had the KMT, the old Chiang Kai-shek party, which was a monopolistic party that controlled things, and then they lost an election, and the new party, the Democratic Party, came in, very, one part of it very idealistic. Now we're finally a democracy. We're going to separate ourselves a bit from China, and then unfortunately they had a president who got accused of corruption. Actually met him before he got accused of corruption. It's my first corrupt head of state. I hope it's my last one. That fell apart, but now, and so then the KMT came back, but now the Democratic Party has reconstituted itself, just won the last election. So that may be an interesting case to look at also. So that's as far as I can go. Okay.
Okay.
In this way of institutional reform, the Brazilian Constitution established that each power have to do an internal control system focused on the legality and efficiency. And we understand that internal control means internal audit, internal affairs, transparency, and citizen participation by ombudsman units. Do you think the effectiveness of the internal control system could be a good strategy to prevent corruption in the public sector, better only one anti-corruption agency or a multi-agency model, as we have in Brazil?
Well, I don't know enough about the Brazil case. I mean, I think it's not really an either-or question. Right? I mean, so there need to be internal audits in any agency to be part of a bureaucratic organization to check on what people are doing, and to let the citizens and the citizen group. Sometimes this is not citizens in some simple sense. It may be an environmental NGO. It may be a business association. It may be whatever groups are unions are affected by the behavior of the agency, and transparency going along with openness to outside critiques. I've been interested in the relationship between these internal attempts it's a mixture of checking. Right? There's a mixture of a kind of not punitive exactly, but legalistic, just being sure the books balance, right? And techniques which actually improve the way in which services are delivered or policy is made, that can involve nothing directly to do with corruption, but the processes by which policies are made. That's my other hat, besides my corruption hat, is in comparative administrative law and public law.
Anti-corruption act.
My anti-corruption hat. Yes, yes, right.
Just to reciprocate.
That's right. That's right. So there's a complementarity between my interest in anti-corruption and my interest in the way in which public agencies make policy, and in trying to argue or think about the tension between technocratic expertise, legal, scientific, economic expertise, and accountability to outsiders, outside groups, both in terms of transparency and in terms of actually listening and responding to outsiders. And that seems to me an important part of more general questions of government reform. There is, I think, an interesting set of questions that have to do with how do freedom of information acts work. As you know, there's been this big expansion of FOIAs all around the world. Brazil has got one. The U.S. is one of the, I think, the original one, although there were ombudsmen, as you know, starting in the Scandinavian countries before that. Of course, they're sort of like necessary but not sufficient conditions, that they're providing information to people who ask. And the key point of a FOIA is that whoever asks for the information doesn't have to give a reason. They just have to say, I'm a citizen, and it's important to me to know this. They don't have to say, I need to use it because I personally have been hurt, right? It's a very important feature of FOIAs, which in their administration, people push on that, push against it. You know, why do you want to know that? We shouldn't have to tell you about that, right? And it's key that not be, you know, the way in which it operates. I've been working with a woman who's actually from Brazil, who was in the army, and saw the refusals of officials in Brazil to provide information about something that she needed to know about, and being concerned about how easy it was for the military to not let people know things, and how few consequences there were for officials that didn't let people know things. Now, of course, you understand the military has got to keep secrets. I mean, there are going to be highly valid reasons why national security can be or operating within a national security bureaucracy can be a reason not to let people know things. But it's too easy to abuse that the valid arguments for secrecy. And so there you need some kind of outside organization to help check the natural incentives of public officials not to have to tell people things unless they have to, right? I think the U.S. is not a good model here. We have a strong FOIA law. You can go on almost any agency, including the Department of Defense, and see how to file the FOIA request. But we don't have any there's no independent agency dealing with FOIA. As opposed to Mexico, I don't know about Brazil, but Mexico has a separate independent agency that sort of monitors and constrains the way in which FOIA gets gets carried out and that you can appeal to. You don't have, in the U.S., you have to go to the courts if you're not happy. There's somebody now in between. You know, a more recent reform in the law put an agency in or an office in an independent, well, not independent, but a part of the federal government that serves as some kind of a place you can go to complain. But it's not a particularly powerful agency. And to have to go to the courts to get what you want is, of course, cumbersome and time-consuming. You could eventually go to the courts in Mexico or in some of the U.S. states, but it doesn't work too well. So I think that's an important piece of this story, is that, okay, there's a certain amount of things that can be done internally in an agency, but if the agency is stonewalling or not providing information, or there's a strong argument for this being in the public interest, or at least there's a question of whether it's in the public interest to make it publicly available. And that's what happens with a FOIA request. If you get the information under a FOIA request, it's not secret information anymore. It's public information, although you can gosh how that would work. So I think that's a set of important things that need to be thought about. I'm interested, and maybe you have some thoughts about it, how to manage citizen participation. I'm kind of in principle interested in it and think it's a valuable piece of the way the administrative process works. But in a big country like Brazil or like the US, just saying, okay, public, you know, come in and participate. Well, it has to be, how are you going to manage that? You know, you can't have 100 million people, you know, coming and knocking on your door. Or if you do, they're all just going to be sending you postcards, which happens. And maybe that's okay. You just count up the postcards, and that provides some evidence that this is something people care about. But there's a wide range of efforts that have been tried involving citizens. You have some interesting examples here that I'm sure Mariana knows about of participatory budgeting in municipalities in Brazil that have had some positive, although some mixed results in other cases. So that's a kind of a general, not so much about corruption, but a general question about how to manage the relationship between citizens in some abstract sense and what actually happens. Yeah. So, stuff.
Let me bring the state back in.
Okay, good.
And because I would like to hear your comments on the widespread and my view simplistic view that the smaller the government, the less corruption a country has. Right? I think you
talk about that.
Yeah, you've written a lot about that, and I think it's...
Yes, I mean, there is an economist who I'm sure you've heard of named Gary Becker, who has written several times about that. Is there a problem back there? Somebody has his hand. Are you asking a question or just can't hear?
No, I want to ask a question, but I can't...
Well, then you need to wait for, okay, yeah, okay. We'll get to questions. So Gary Becker has written several things about if you want to get rid of corruption, get rid of government. Well, oh, yes, you know, if there were no government, nobody to pay bribes, then it would only be like commercial bribery. But, you know, obviously that's forgetting that maybe government's doing some things that people want. And of course he has an ideology in favor of the market handling everything, right? And that if only you just let it go, everything would be fine. Or that it's not so much that he doesn't understand that markets can fail as that he thinks that government fails even worse. So that's the first point, right? That it's all of us who work on corruption should never think that corruption is the only thing that matters, right? It's a piece of a bigger puzzle that has to do with the democratic accountability of government and the quality of the services, goods and services that are being provided. The other point is a more narrow point, which is that sometimes by reducing the size of a program, you're increasing the amount of corruption, right? So one of my examples was a public program that was scarce. You know, there were only a few contracts that were going to be let. There were only a few places in public housing or a few places in the university. They were scarce. The reason why there was corruption was that people were using their payoffs to allocate this scarce thing. Right? If you make it even more scarce, Well, there'll be, the price will go up because the thing becomes even more valuable by through reducing supply. So that's a particular kind of set of cases. I mean, the broader point is obviously, I think most of us hope the government's going to actually do something, and that we can think about ways to organize it with fewer corrupt incentives. But there's also this kind of direct connection in some cases too.
Okay. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the FGV Law for the invitation to be here this morning, and congratulate the professor for your lecture this morning, and also your new book. And I have my question is, in your opinion, what would be the most difficult effort in Brazil to combat corruption, and also if you believe if more severe penalties would be effective in the combat against corruption, especially in high-level corruption? Well,
it's kind of an empirical question. What's most difficult? That's probably a question for the Brazilians. But my hunch is that sort of constitutional reform is going to be particularly difficult. And there's always a problem with a reform where the people that have to make the reform are the people who are benefiting from the status quo. And so how does it ever happen, right? It's a kind of a mystery, because it does sometimes happen that people who have benefited in the past see that they need to make a change. And maybe you're moving in that direction. It's that part of it is the upset by ordinary people, and I'm sure by portions of the business community and professional community that can make it seem politically desirable to make at least some kinds of change. And it's too easy in my book to say, okay, let's just make the penalties higher. Well, maybe that has a marginal effect. I don't mean to deny that there's some incentive effect on thinking that the penalties are high, but the downside is you make them too high, and then they're like the atomic bomb, right? You can't actually use them because they're too high, and you feel sorry for the poor guys, in some way. I mean, this was the point that somebody was making, Mr. Godoy, Professor Godoy, there you are, over there, about the problem of putting firms out of business as a result of the penalties. First of all, it's not there. The problem is not just the size of the penalties, but who they're directed toward, who's going to suffer from them, and that the penalties need to be levied so they cause harm to those who have designed the thing, and even maybe some concern for the people who haven't. So I don't think just severe, maybe better targeted, and maybe different kinds of penalties, and penalties that have to do with reform going forward. I mean, that's the deferred prosecution story. Right? That's part of what you're trying, and which doesn't just stop by saying, okay, we've got a nice little plan, now go ahead and put it into effect, but with some ongoing. Think about the Siemens case, right? You probably know about the Siemens case. That involved basically long-term monitoring by outsiders who were kind of operating inside the corporation to kind of be sure that they had actually changed the way they behaved. I spent a year at the World Bank as a visiting scholar writing the 99 book in 95, 96. And there was somebody there, a young woman who was working, was on a fellowship from Siemens. And she said at one point, yeah, we put, there's these things on the balance sheet that say NA, which means in German, necessary payment. Notische Ausgabe or something. When you see that, it means that's a bribe. We're keeping it in our books. So, that hopefully has changed as a result of these things. So I guess it's more that, are the penalties targeted so that they have a deterrent effect going forward, so people know what they are? Because the penalty is one thing to just say, okay, you were a bad guy and I'm going to punish you, but let's think about as having some structural effect on the way business operates, or politicians operate, going forward.
Well, some economists, they claim that corruption may be good in some situations. And like the general idea is to grease the wheels. And my reading of your book is that you are critical of this this view.
I didn't think I was too subtle.
Yeah, but and what I think is interesting, you may acknowledge that corruption, that very specific setting, may have a benefit, but it's more a symptom of something that is bad in the design of the policy institutions. And moreover, there is this problem of the dynamic effect of corruption, so more people asking for bad regulations. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. So you've already kind of made part of the point. Well, this your last point of the way in which observing the corruption of others can lower your own threshold for engaging in corruption. As I was pointing out, it's very easy to get vicious cycles or virtuous cycles. And there's part of that that has to do with just, well, I guess it's not so bad, everybody's doing it. And there's also has to do with overwhelming the enforcement capacity of either the prosecutors or, in your cases, the guys who are inside the agency. The more widespread corruption is with a kind of fixed number of enforcers, the lower proportion of the corruption they're going to see. And then people observe, well, I guess we can get away with this. This is kind of, occasionally you might get caught, but probably not, so then I guess I'll be corrupt, right? And then it's if anybody knows Thomas Schelling, he's full of these kind of models where the more corruption there is, the more corruption there is, right? Because of not just because of the weakening of moral constraints, but the concrete weakening of actually getting caught, and so you spiral to a bad equilibrium. And then you can also spiral to a good equilibrium, right? If you're a very low level of corruption, you can more justifiably worry that you're going to be caught because there are not very many other people who are corrupt, and the law enforcement guys are not being spread around as thin. So there's that problem. Now, the grease versus sand is the other image. Is it grease that makes things go well, or is it sand? Well, of course, you have to admit, sometimes in the short term, as a practical matter, it's grease. I mean, it gets things done. People get their license. They don't have to pay their parking ticket. They're on their way. But the problem, of course, with the grease argument is that it is this kind of building on itself, and that if the underlying program had some value, keeping people from speeding, stopping them from going through red lights, having only people who were qualified, who knew how to drive, getting driver's licenses, right? There was some actual concrete reason why there was this sand there, why there was this friction. Then simply tolerating the corruption just undermines those purposes. Which isn't to say there shouldn't be some way to reform the program to kind of reduce some of those incentives. Now, of course, I have an example of somebody paying a bribe to get themselves out of a Nazi concentration camp, right? Then I think most of us would say that was desirable. The underlying system was so unacceptable, so morally terrible, that if you could get out of it in whatever way you chose, fine, right? We're not going to condemn you for doing that. But it does suggest that in thinking about reform, you need to think about what is it that's being bought? And if you thought, when you looked at what was being bought, oh, that's not so bad. I don't want to be for sale. Well, make it for sale, right? Make it legally for sale. It's one, I think a good example for me is import quotas. So a good economist doesn't like import quotas, right? It's not efficient. You shouldn't have them. But they do exist in some countries. I don't know about Brazil, but they do. Okay. So if they're who should get import quota if it's, say, for capital equipment? Well, the firms that can make the most use of it. Well, who are those? Well, they both have to be not worry about breaking the law, but they also have to think it will be valuable for them to pay, you know, to get this thing, to get profits. So this sounds like a perfect example of just legally selling them. What's the matter with the person who will pay the most getting the import quota? That's going to be the most efficient. You didn't have some kind of, it's not like paying for places in FJV law school, right? Hopefully nobody did that. But because then you don't think there's a very good match between willingness to pay and ability to benefit from the educational effort. But it should be a part of the reform agenda not to be scared about the idea that you could mix money with the provision of certain kinds of public services. And you should ask the question, is there supposed to be helping the poor, is it supposed to be helping the qualified, or not? Well, probably you can do this in Brazil. If you wanted to get your passport fast in the US, you can legally pay a lot of money. You can send it by FedEx, and you can pay much more money than if you were smart and organized your time right? But if you have to get it fast, you can pay for it, right? It doesn't go into the pocket of the bureaucrat. It goes into the pocket of the US Treasury. But it is an example of something where there's a cost. Everybody else has to wait a little longer. But it's not a big cost because many people can plan ahead, right? So it's a piece of what ought to be thought about. Okay.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Well, talking about legalizing illegal things, what's your opinion about drugs? How far we should go in legalizing drugs?
Yeah. No, I think we should legalize most drugs and regulate them, like alcohol or tobacco, right? I think there's some question. I'm not an expert on drugs, but there are some things that
Neither I am.
Okay, all right, good. Right, from experts out here, maybe. All right. Maybe we should hope there are no experts out there. There are some drugs that just get you completely hooked so quickly. I mean, seem to be some things that are almost like poisons.
Right.
But in general, it seems like would be a good move. We're starting to do that with marijuana in the U.S. And we have this odd situation where many states, not many, but several states have legalized the sale of marijuana, but it's still illegal at the federal level. They're not enforcing it, but it's kind of sitting out there. Would this help for a country like Mexico? I don't know about whether Brazil has the problems in Brazil, but in Mexico, it's become huge problem. Yeah. I mean, in Mexico, what happened is the U.S. government had this strategy of trying to catch the drug runners coming across the Caribbean in airplanes and boats and things, and they were pretty successful at that. Well, what did the drug guys do? They didn't decide, to open a tourist hotel in Colombia. Instead, they are now shipping them through Mexico. Much more serious. If you had to make that choice, if those were the only choices, it was better to have it go through the Caribbean than through Mexico, a country of over 100 million people. And it's had very, very destructive impact. Now, of course, mafias will find other things to do. They can traffic in people, they can do guns, they can do all kinds of things. So it's not a panacea, but that connection is very strong, and I think it's an issue that really needs to be thought seriously about, and it's very hard to have that discussion in the U.S. But it should be on the table. Yeah.
I think Laura is having another question.
Yeah, Professor, still talking about legalization. Here in Brazil, lobby is not a legalized activity. Mm-hmm. And talking about reforms, is this necessary reform to Brazil?
You mean to legalize lobbying?
Yeah.
Well, lobbying is one. My quick answer is yes. But what is lobbying? Lobbying is one of those weird terms that it's very easy to use it in a very negative way, and of course it can be negative. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be illegal just because it's negative, but it can be negative, in that it's like certain groups having too much power over what kinds of laws are passed or what kinds of regulations are passed because they have some kind of special access to either the public officials who are passing the regulations or deciding enforcement priorities or inside the legislature. So it's something that needs to be regulated and thought about. But the positive side of lobbying, however, I don't know how you define it here, right, has to do with providing information to elected officials and bureaucrats about who cares about what happens in the government. Now, of course, the reason why it's criticized, is that who is going to be most able to engage in lobbying? Well, groups that have money, business associations, labor unions, even NGOs who are more organized, not as rich as business, but more organized. We have a lot of very strong environmental groups in the U.S. who are not as rich as the business associations, but are relatively well funded through private donations, and they're providing information about bills that are before Congress. They're suggesting things that should be on the agenda. And I think it would be hard to avoid it, right? If you're a member of Congress and you're a committee chairman and you're trying to draft a statute, you actually want to know, what different groups care about. So it's more really like the drug question, right? Something that should be regulated, but it shouldn't be made a crime, to lobby. If by that we mean making some kind of contact with a public official. Some of that can be handled through the requirement of open hearings. I mean, that's my other hat here. The administrative law hat is that when say the environmental ministry is making a rule, they should be required to have public open hearings and take testimony from people. And then when they come up with a rule, they should be required to justify it, in terms of their own expertise and the information that they've got from outside. Right? And as a way of constraining, simply making the decision in a way that follows somebody who's taking you out to dinner. Right? And of course, there can be restrictions on the nature of private benefits. When does it slop over and become close to corruption? The nature of private benefits that lobbyists can give in terms of meals and trips. I mean, one big problem in the U.S. is, which is attempts to be regulated, junkets. I don't know what's the Portuguese for junket? A nice trip somewhere. To Rio for the Olympics. There probably are. Probably if we looked. Tickets to, because actually there were some of that in Beijing, and there probably is a good chunk here. So there's a lot of line drawing here, but simply to make it illegal it does not seem to me like the right approach. It'll just go underground, it'll be happening, and all the rest of us won't know about it, or we'll just suspect that all kinds of nasty things are going on. So that's what you have to do. The journalists have to keep tabs on it. Yeah.
By the way, sorry, can I?
Yeah.
No, you just mentioned one example of turning something illegal. I mean, the possibility of turning something illegal with bad results, right? And then immediately came to my mind the decision taken by the Brazilian Supreme Court of banning private donations to electoral campaign. And so, based on let's say on comparative evidence and on a global level, is there any strong correlation between, let's say, private donations to electoral campaign and on the one side and corruption on the other side? What are your comments on that issue?
Well, I don't know that anybody's really done that as a study. That would be you have to do that as a study.
Yeah, I will ask for funds for it. Oscar has just left the room, so yeah. The first point, of course, is that electoral campaigns have to be funded somehow, one answer is to have very restricted private donations and have public funding, which raises its own set of questions about not favoring incumbents. It's too easy to design those things so that incumbents have it better because they have free publicity. Now, of course, I don't want to talk about U.S. politics, but of course we have a candidate for president who is just brilliant at generating free publicity. Donald Trump. Who is he?
Yeah. But I worry about outright bans on private donations, particularly on corporate donations, because I'm afraid it will just push it underground, rather than trying to have a more transparent part of it. And that it's okay, you could do it. I don't know how this Supreme Court decision fits in with the rest of your provisions for financing political campaign. So is it a real worry that what will happen is that it will still go on and it will just happen in a more, well, we'll go to this private club that we're both a member of. You know, there's a nice paper that somebody wrote on France, right, where this is a real problem of a kind of an insider group, you know, that all goes to the same clubs and they all, you know, talk to each other, and helps you're a big country. That may dampen it a bit, but it's a we better have it out in the one, out on the surface, and two, have other alternative ways of funding campaigns. Through public money, there's a proposal that my husband made with a colleague of mine, ours, Ian Ayers, on giving people vouchers. It involves public funding, but it's like crowdsourcing, right? So everybody gets a voucher of a certain amount of money that they can spend on a mixture of primaries and general elections. So everybody, you know, poor, rich, and they can't, and you try to avoid, there's various ways they worry about corruption. I've been a little skeptical of some of it because I was worried the whole thing would get corrupted, but they have some clever ways to try to dampen that. But so they needs to go together. But I have a question mark about this decision. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Oh yes.
About these problems in the electoral system,
yeah.
And because our operation quick wash, no, for car wash, right, revealed that the illegal use of the public companies as a source of bribes and dirty money for electoral campaigns. Even so, the huge oil company controlled by the state and in the epicenter of the scandal does not put the salaries and all the contracts in the internet yet, and continue to select providers listed by a restricted administrative process. So, is it possible to prevent corruption and promote democratic control under government-owned enterprise without full transparency and opening?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's a little bit the question somebody was asking before about this kind of private law, public law, right? So I'm sure that Petrobras says, oh, we get to follow the legal benefits of the same as a private company. We're sort of competing with them. We're like a market actor on the one side when it benefits them. And then when on the other side, when it's going to benefit them to be a public company, they'll say that too, right? So my bias, I guess I would say, is toward pushing the public companies toward the public sector and the kinds of obligations that they have of transparency. And even going further to say fully private companies that no government ownership or anything, just fully private, but they're contracting with the government. That should go along with heightened responsibility to be clear about what they're doing, right? And things that, and I don't know, maybe we can go, maybe it's also true fully private companies ought to, that don't contract with government should be more transparent about things. But I do think that's important. There's been some interesting work in the European Union. There's now much more, a lot of transparency about contracts involving European Union funds that are basically online. There have been some researchers in Europe who have been studying kind of implicit corruption. In other words, they don't actually know about bribes, but they're saying, look, what are the risk factors about corruption? And can we look at the contracts and see how important those risk factors are? So one is a cutoff. So if the contract isn't above, 500,000 euros or something, I don't know what the number is, but some number. If it's below that, you don't have to have competitive bidding. So they check what proportion of the contracts are just, 10 euros, below the cutoff, and take that as if you see a lot of that, that's a risk factor that those contracts, they do that because they want to favor somebody. And look at how many contracts were let without competition, where there's a single source single source contracts. And they've done some interesting stuff of pulling those things together, which they could only do because that information is out there. So, and the interesting thing about that is that it isn't just getting at an individual contract. It's saying, look, here's something systemic about the way the government is interacting with private firms that raises some red flags about what's going on. So I agree with you. These should be treated more in terms of their public value going forward. Yeah, and that wouldn't be that tough, right? Right? They have the information. It's just they have to make it public. Okay.
Well, I would like also to give the opportunity for any member of the audience that would like to make any questions. So, but before passing to the general public, let's call that way, we have a preference that is from our dean, Professor Oscar, because he was trying to make you a question during the first event, and for some reason, Caio didn't allow him to make the question. Yeah, and runs the risk of being fired. So you still have the question, Professor Oscar?
Who is Caio? It's a former professor.
It's a former professor.
In some sense, I made the question during the coffee break, but perhaps for the public benefit. Just shifting a little bit from what you've been discussing, one of the parts of the book that I admire most was the cultural chapter, because you don't fall on the trap of viewing corruption as something that is intrinsic to certain culture. So it's very nice not to have a culturalist approach to corruption. However, I would like to ask you if you found in your research or in your readings correlations to another structural variable, which is inequality. Approaching, taking the transparency list and see the first 10, and then you see the Human Development Index and put the same, the parallel. I didn't do any mathematical correlation, but just a visual correlation would say the less unequal countries are the most, or the less corrupt. And if you go to the bottom, you will also find. So do you, in rule of law, there are several papers written about it showing that there is a strong correlation about inequality, deep and persistent inequality. It's not just any kind of inequality that will fragilize the notion that the law is being applied equally to all. So do you find something, could you tell us about this?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of scholars who've put a big emphasis on this. One is Boo Rothstein, just moved into Oxford, and a guy named Eric Uslander, who's at the University of Maryland, have put a big focus on the state treating people sort of fairly or equally as a way of justifying that is very closely associated with people's view of the state as legitimate. Right? Now, they want to call corruption deviations from that. Right? I think that's wrong. I don't think that's the right way at it. That's kind of prejudging. That's saying I want to call corruption rather than saying there's this phenomena over here called corruption and it may cause something, right? Rather than that it is corruption. That doesn't. I don't think that's helpful. It's kind of misses a step. Right? On the other hand, I take your point that there does seem to be some connection. And the question is, why? Where does that connection come from? What I was mentioning to you in the coffee break is there is some interesting work by a professor named Yu and another professor whose name I was trying to remember, but anyway, who I cite in here. What their idea is that that inequality is inherently, in a democracy, is inherently a kind of unstable situation. be seeing a bit of this in the U.S. current election here, right? Where we've had a growth in inequality, right? So it's a kind of unstable thing in a democracy where you think ideally it's supposed to be the majority that's ruling, right? But there's more than a majority is like in the bottom bottom hump of the distribution. Their story is that one of the things that maintains such regimes is that there's a kind of wealthy elite, which may include the sort of business elite, which basically buys off the state. You know, that is corrupt in that kind of grand corruption way of keeping the politicians happy, you know, through corrupt deals. So it's the maintenance. It's not really explaining where the inequality came from in the first place, but it's saying if you have this big inequality and you still have the democratic forms there, one way in which those are maintained over time is through the oligarchic business people collaborating with, becoming the same as, in some case, the political elite, which shows up as a bad number. Notice these corruption indices. That a low number is a bad number. Right? So a highly corrupt country has a low number. Some of the research flips it around. Be careful when you're reading it that you get it right. But what I always say is, since we're in Olympic time, it's like gymnastics scoring. Right? It's really exactly. The best thing is a 10. Right? The worst thing is a 1. So that would just be one response. Yeah.
Okay, so before passing the questions to the audience, the members of our table, okay, for you? Can you pass to the audience? Okay. So not too many questions, please. And
one question per person.
Yeah, one question per person, and short in preference. And I will ask you to, when making the question, to pose your. We are recording, so we would like you to pose your name and the institution that you belong to. Okay.
Hi, Professor. I am Artur Prado. I am studying here. My question is how to measure the deterrence effect of a criminal sanction on of a corruption act. Mm-hmm. And if you have some time to speak about, we have here in Brazil like a keyword, it's impunity and fight against impunity. And at the same time in your lecture, you said about when you make so much agreements and leniency, it may be to fight against impunity, you may create a sense of impunity. So my question is, when we can win and how we can win impunity if it's so subjective?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily subjective, but it's first, I don't think there's anybody who's done a really good study on the deterrent effects of criminal sanctions in the corruption area. I mean, there's some in other in other areas of law, but there's an inherent problem with this topic, right? Which is why it's kind of never going to go away. But people have to find clever ways of studying it, which is that inherently getting data on the subject is very hard because everybody is trying to keep it secret, on both sides.
Which is totally unfair, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely unfair. That's what it is. There have been a few. There was, but there's a couple of examples which suggest that there is a deterrent effect of criminal sanctions. So there's a nice study that was done in Argentina, right, where the hospital authority thought there was a lot of corruption in the purchasing of standardized products for hospitals, like saline solution. Right? So they had the nice advantage that you knew what was being bought. It was something you ought to be able to go shopping at Staples for. Right? It was a very, I guess it wouldn't work because not too many ordinary people are buying this, but it was a standardized product. So the Central Hospital Authority got information from all the hospitals about how much they were paying, and the prices were like all over the map. Right? So they said, if you report to us a price that's higher, than one standard deviation from the mean, we're going to investigate you. So they just set that out as an information thing, and we're going to punish you. And what happened as a result of that, threatening punishment, was that the variance shrank, there was much less variance, and the mean fell. Right? So that's just a kind of nice, clean example of a threat of sanction having a deterrent effect. There's unfortunately not a happy story because they didn't keep doing it. Right? I mean, that only would matter if they actually punished you when you were way up on the side, and apparently they didn't. But at least it's evidence ahead of time. Well, they should have, kept doing that. There's a study of none of this is about grand corruption, which is just much harder to study because it comes in small packages. I mean, big packages, but there's a small number of them, per country. Somebody studied education spending it's a famous study in Uganda, where the central government gave education money to the low-level governments, and more like 85% of it disappeared. They had 2 sets of books is often a good way to study corruption. If it's measured in one place and another, you can see how much disappeared, right? So they had how much the central government was supposed to pay, how much went to the local governments, and a huge proportion of it disappeared, and a lot of variation. This was not a criminal prosecution. They said, look, here we had citizen participation in some sense. The local school boards, the local villages where the money was coming, actually had pretty good parent-teacher associations left over from Idi Amin's dictatorship when there was nothing coming from the government. So the people had to get organized at the local level to have any education. And had these people monitoring being told what was supposed to come in through newspaper reports and monitoring what actually came in. So that's a nice example, not of criminal sanctions, but of a monitoring that tries to get around that. Now, I quite agree that this concept of impunity is very important and is basically a way of saying people can get away with it. It's not something that you have to really worry about, and that it is important to get around that so people don't feel impunity. But there is a I guess there's 3. It has to be. You have to do it in a way that there's still considerable risk in engaging in corruption, but we're providing a way out for the people who can be, or the firms, who can be genuinely determined to be interested in making some kind of cultural change or behavioral change in their actions. So it's got to be, if you have this kind of leniency agreement, it's got to be combined with pretty strict monitoring of what happens, right? So it's not as if it's not just trust me. It's because what you're looking for is behavioral change over time, right? It's not, and there is this particular problem with corporations. You can't put the corporation in jail. Can you have corporate criminal liability in Brazil? You can hold corporations criminally liable? Yes. Only regarding the environment. Huh, that's interesting. Because, so you're like many countries in Europe. It comes out of the idea that somehow organizations can't quite feel guilty. Right? That's apparently a French revolutionary principle. But even the French have changed their law to make, in a limited way, to make corruption a crime, a crime that organizations can be held guilty of. We in the U.S. are much more pragmatic. We don't kind of worry about whether they feel guilty or not, right? It's just a pragmatic choice about should we go under a civil remedy or a criminal remedy, and of course the cost of a criminal remedy is the greater protections for the or you could say the benefit, the greater procedural protections for somebody or an organization accused of a crime, even though you can't put a corporation in jail, it's a pretty shameful thing, to get a lot of press about being held criminally liable for something. So I think it still does have some kind of deterrent effect. And the leniency agreements are not saying you didn't do anything wrong, right? So it's important that it go along with you did do something wrong, and here's a sort of a pragmatic response to how to deal with that. given that ordinary sorts of punishment don't match very well, with the nature of the beast that engaged in this activity.
Okay. Next.
Hi, my name is Guilherme. I also work at the Ombudsman Office of the state of São Paulo. And one of the questions that often emerges when we talk about corruption nowadays, that many NGOs pointed out, is the need for whistleblowing protection. Because of, well, as it was said before, it's hard to find out about corruption, so you have to count with the information from inside or from people that learn from it. And there are some initiatives that try not only to protect whistleblowers, but also to incentive and even to pay money. What I would like to know is, how do we see this experience of whistleblowing protection? Is it spreading? Is there a spreading legislation about it? And what are your views on these incentives and the risks it may bring together with it?
Yeah, good. I think that it is actually something that's spreading, or that at least there's more discussion about it recently. And as you probably know, the U.S. has quite, at the federal level at least, quite strong protection for whistleblowers inside the state, public officials whose jobs are protected. They can't be paid. Right? They just can't be penalized in terms of their promotion possibilities or their job possibilities. They retain, their civil service protections. For whistleblowers outside the government, private sector whistleblowers who are pointing, it's not just corruption, but other kinds of malfeasance, fraud, probably a lot would have to do with fraud, to do with people dealing with government either as direct contractors or who are producing goods such as pharmaceuticals, which are then purchased through Medicare or Medicaid. They actually have quite high financial incentives of like 5 or 10% of any ultimate money that's disgorged to go back to the government. Although of course it can be misused, this seems like a desirable thing, because usually, I mean, the usual case studies you read of whistleblowers is that it's really a hard thing to do, right? I mean, you get ostracized by your employers and your fellow workers, and it may take years until anything happens. The way it works in the U.S. is if you have to report, you don't just do it on your own. You report to the government about the whistleblowing, about the malfeasance you've seen, and then the government can decide to take the case. If they take it, then the reward you could get is much less, but you still will get some kind of reward. If the government says, no, I'm not going to take it, you can go ahead and take it. Well, we have, I don't know whether you have contingent fees. Do you have contingent fees for lawyers here? That, you only get paid if you win? Yeah. Because that's an important feature, which is not true of some European countries think that's immoral or something, right? But it's a very important aspect of this kind of a lawsuit, that lawyers will take it as on spec, essentially as a gamble, and they have to make a judgment of what the risks are, and then they take on the investigative part of it and to bring it to fruition. And then, of course, they are going to get a good share because it's a risky deal to do it. They're very likely to lose. I'm sorry. They get a good chunk of what goes to the whistleblower. So we can argue about the details. Is the percentage too high? But the basic idea of providing some kind of sort of safe harbor for people that report things that they see. And of course, it assumes you've got some basic trust in the way the judicial system works, right? So it can't just be used as a kind of witch hunt, that you just don't like somebody and so you threaten, to blow the whistle on them. That you can feel, which is a very important part of the criminal law discussion of corruption, is not only convicting the guilty, but protecting people who are who actually haven't done anything wrong or anything terribly wrong from prosecution. So it's good to bring that up. I think that's important. piece of the toolkit. Yeah.
Okay, in order to keep track with our schedule, I think that we have, we can have one more question.
He had his hand up a lot earlier. So.
Okay,
Maybe
so you have two questions.
Two
Okay, if you agree, two
yes,
questions. Okay.
Two questions, I agree.
Okay, one and the second.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rodrigo. I'm a professor of law. And my question is that we are all professors of law, lawyers, practitioners here, and we are always asking what the law has got to do with it, right? I remember Dean Harold Coe at Yale Law School addressing an audience of freshmen. He said, well, you should always ask what the law has got to do with it. It's the Tina Turner question. It's not what's love got to do with it, but what's the law got to do with it. But, but my question is, and is there something else about beyond the law? I mean, we all believe in the power of transformation of the law, but law, of course, can establish many incentives for corruption or obstacles. But is there anything that can be done beyond changing the law? We've just talked about constitutional reforms that might be necessary, especially to deal with the political reform and this subject. But any change in the behavior of the public administration, is there any experience that was carried down in any country to tackle corruption, but that didn't require a huge legal reform? That's
yeah, I don't. I mean, I know I can't necessarily. There's lots of cases, right? So I think one piece of this, which may not have to do with the law in some formal sense, has to do with public administration reform, which might have a piece of it, which was the law of civil service, but that part of it just has to do with the way in which the bureaucracies are being managed and organized, and providing incentives for officials inside of the bureaucracy to behave efficiently and to be monitored on the basis of their efficiency, which doesn't have to be threatening them with criminal prosecution, but with rewarding them for behaving well. Right? I mean, the famous acronym is New Public Management. Now, that's a piece of the story, right, as having, but it doesn't capture it all, I don't think, right? Because that's maybe a little too close to Sergio's point about analogies to the private sector and going too far with analogies to the private sector, because that's part of it is treat the people you're dealing with like customers, not like, you know, enemies. And of course, and there's a piece of it that I think is important, but it needs to be part of a general problem about how our services delivered, which are organizational problems, not necessarily legal problems. And that has to do with the police, with the way in which the police operates, or the military. I think that's true. And then that will. And it's part of my idea of starting out with where the problem is, you know, where the rents are, or who's grabbing them, and then the law has a role to play. But I think you should never imagine that it's the only thing that's going to do it, right? You can't just pass the law and expect it to enforce itself. And in some of these bureaucratic cases, and it may require some reconstitution of the way a particular bureaucratic thing operates, how it recruits people, you know, into that system. Yeah.
Obrigado. Good morning, Professor Ackerman. My name is João Antonio. I'm here from FGV University. I'm a student. I would like to ask you, in your whole text and speech, you talk about the incentives, the economic incentives, and I would like to ask you, regarding the information about corruption that the people get, what would be the incentives for people to be cynic and stop caring and not pressing for changes? What would be the incentive for people pressing for changes? Why do you have different consequences of the information of corruption in different countries?
Yeah. Well, a big question that I can't answer in a couple of minutes, but well, there's a basic problem if you're in one of these bad cycles. You know, I was talking about good cycles and bad cycles. And if you're in a bad cycle in which corruption, everybody sees a lot of corruption, and then they say, why shouldn't I be corrupt? And it all kind of feeds on itself. Those are the toughest cases. We've seen examples, I was trying to give some, of situations where that has been turned around. But it's not going to happen by marginal changes. I mean, a margin, you just join a little bit, marginal. You get up there and it'll spiral right back. You know, you've got two equilibria, a good one and a bad one, and you just move a little tiny bit away from the bad one, and you've got to do it in a way that it can build, that the winners who then become advocates for going farther. And how to do that it was going to depend on the case, but it's you know, in the civil service reform case, you get people who have been recruited on the basis of some kind of a merit judgment on their own skills in doing things, and then they become advocates for keeping that service that system in place because they've benefited from it, right? So you're trying to kind of convert a bad spiral into a good spiral, but it's obviously harder, and that's why I think there's some. To just end on what I hope is a hopeful note, you know, there's some hopeful thing in Brazil in that people really do seem to be concerned, right? And that there's a way to kind of push back against the cynics. That is, you know, why are you just accepting the fact that you're somehow culturally stuck with this, right? I don't think that necessarily. We have examples of other places that aren't. But that's not easy. You know, it takes work to have that kind of a change happen. So, can end on that.
Okay. So, thank you, Professor Ackerman, for your answers. And before ending this session, I'd like to thank the members of the table, starting with Sergio. When saw by the audience, you are in the extreme left. When seen by the audience. Thank you, Paulo, Nino, Gustavo, and Laura for your participation. And again, thank you, Professor Ackerman, for your words.
Well,
thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Let's give room for everybody to step out. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
It's okay.
No,
Sorry.
Não.